So I wanted to start with a question for all of you, which is, what is the worst thing your code has ever done? And kind of, why did it happen? And hopefully it wasn't as bad as a nuclear disaster. While you think about that, this is a picture of my cat. His name is Elrond. His hobbies include going to sleep in dangerous and inconvenient positions, like the stairs. I'm Frederick Cheung. I help organize LRUG in London, so second Monday of the month. If you're ever in town, we'd love to have you. We'd love to have you speak or attend. I'm the lead engineer at Skidder Whale, who very kindly paid for my travel and hotel and everything, so I could be here today with you. And the very short pitch is, videos and training are fine. They're a great way to learn. But what people really learn from it is experience, and what we try and do is accelerate that. So our micro workshops are about taking people through that kind of loop of learning some theory, applying it to a problem, getting some feedback. And yeah, great way to learn. And to answer my own question, I once accidentally sent about 100,000 premium rated text messages. So all those people got charged $2 to receive those messages, which was not great. Right, so start with some nuclear fission basics, just what's going on. The non-relativistic time-dependent Schrödinger equation. Just kidding. I did a Google search for complicated equations, and this was quite high at the top. So what happens is you have a neutron, it comes and it hits some uranium, it's absorbed, but this is unstable, so it splits, it releases some byproducts, it releases some energy, and crucially, it releases neutrons, these guys here. And if those neutrons, on average, hit fewer than one new uranium atom, then the reaction will slow down. More than one atom, and it will speed up. And there are a lot of these fissions happening. So if you want 1 watt of thermal power, you need about 30 billion fissions per second. And each of the Chernobyl reactor units are about 3 gigawatts of thermal power. So if you remember one thing from this, it's remember the neutrons. Controlling the reaction means controlling the neutrons. This is the type of reactor used at Chernobyl. It means high-power channel-type reactor. In April 1986, when the disaster occurred, there were 4 of these in operation, 4 of these units at Chernobyl, with 2 more under construction that were never finished for obvious reasons. And this is about a high-level schematic of what the plant looked like, or each individual unit. You have your fuel rods. So these are metal tubes. They're filled with pellets of uranium. This is where the fission is actually happening. You have the moderator. So for reasons of physics, the neutrons come out from the fission at very high speed. If you want them to be more likely to hit other stuff and continue the reaction, you need to slow them down. And that's what the moderator does. And in this reactor design, the moderator is graphite, also a form of carbon. You have control rods. So this is how you slow the reaction down or speed it up. They're made of something that absorbs neutrons. So if you want to slow the reaction down, you insert them into the core, and they'll take away some of those neutrons. You want to speed it up, you pull them out. And then you've got your plumbing. So you've got water pumped in at the bottom. It boils inside the reactor, and so steam comes out at the top. And that's what you use to drive your turbines and generate the electricity. And this is something that's more like the physical layout. So you have the core. This is about 7 meters tall. It's made of graphite bricks, and they're pierced with channels for the fuel rods and the control rods and so on. Sitting above and below it are what they call the biological shield. So each one of these is about 1,000 tons or so of concrete with various minerals in it that absorb radiation. This isn't like a concrete containment building like other reactors have. It's just sitting there. It's held on by gravity. We're just sitting on top of that metal support around the side. The top one is called Elena for reasons. At the top, you have the channels where the control rods go up and down, the fuel rods. In this reactor design, while it's running, you can pop those covers off and refuel it, do a zero downtime deploy, as it were. And then you've got a steel cylinder around the side, which is the support for the biological shield, and water and sand to keep the nasty stuff in. And that steel cylinder around the side is not a reactor pressure vessel. It doesn't cover the top. It is just around the side. This is like what it actually looks like. So this is a reactor in Leningrad of the same design, but built a few years earlier. And you see it's quite big. You see those people in the distance there. And each one of those little gray rectangles there is a fuel channel. And the colored ones are various types of control rods and neutron detectors and so So designs don't come out of nowhere. They're always sort of non-technical constraints. It's true for Chernobyl, it's true for software projects. So maybe you pick a technology that your team already knows, or a technology that's easy to recruit for. Or maybe it's just that the surrounding ecosystem or community is particularly vibrant. So what does that mean for this reactor design? What do they want out of it? Well, they want quick and modular production, and they'd also like their slides back. It's the radiation, it's fine. So these graphite bricks, they can assemble them on site. Pressure vessels are not so great because pressure vessels require complicated, precise engineering. You've got to make this great big metal structure. It has holes in it so that pipes can go in and out, but it has to withstand, the radiation and the heat of the nuclear reaction. Yeah. Where were we? Oh yeah, pressure vessels, they're complicated. You've got to make this great big metal structure. Yeah, thanks a lot for sorting it out. It's a complicated metal structure. It's got to be very tough to keep all the bad stuff on the inside. But you've got holes in it for all the pipes to come out, and it's submitted to a lot of heat and radiation. So if they can avoid that, that'll be better. They'd like to use uranium that's been less enriched than normal. So designs in the West at the time enriched to about 4%, but they think they can run them about 1.8%, which is just a lot cheaper. And they want it to be powerful. Soviet industry needs a lot of power. They do have another much safer design that they use at the same time as well, but it's not as powerful. So what are the consequences of all this? Well, they need a lot of power, and the design, because of the manufacturing process, isn't very dense. So it's very big. The core is best part of 20 times the volume of other designs. Because of that, there is no reinforced concrete building around the outside because it would just be too big and too expensive. There's no pressure vessel, but they say, well, we kind of have to do something, right? So they say, well, each individual, they're going to have these 1,600 pressure tubes. They put the fuel rods in it, and these pressure tubes will contain any localized failures. And they estimate that 1 or 2 pressure tubes can fail, and things will still be okay. Any design has its limits, right? When you deploy a web application, maybe you say, well, we can tolerate the loss of one availability zone. Or maybe you have slightly more elevated needs, and you design something that has multi-region capability. There's not a right answer to this, but this is a pretty modest target because they estimate that with 3 or 4 tubes failing, they will lose containment. But like the Titanic, they thought they had enough hulls. 1 or 2 should be fine. There are also some design flaws. So it has a thing called a positive void coefficient. And what that is that neutrons are more readily absorbed by water than by steam. So as the reactor heats up, if more water turns to steam, then those neutrons are not being absorbed so much, so the reactant speeds up, so there's more steam, so it heats up more, and it just keeps on going. Other reactors have the opposite behavior, where if they start overheating, the change to steam will slow them down, and those are very nice, but they kind of behave quite stably. But that's not what we have here. It's very hard to monitor and to control, especially at low power levels. Partly that's because of the positive coefficient. It's like balancing a pencil on its end. It's always kind of trying to fall out of line. And it's partly because of the size. It's just so big that it's like actually having half a dozen nuclear reactors that you're trying to control all at the same time, especially when the fuel levels are low. So it's running hot in one part, cold in another part. The operators, they emerge from their shifts, soaked in sweat. They wear out the controls at their stations from there adjusting it so often. It's a very unpredictable design, which is not a good word to have in the same sentence as nuclear reactor. And it suffers from something called positive scram, which I'll explain. So I drew this nice drawing of a nuclear core, reactor core. You've got these control rods at the top. So remember, they absorb neutrons. They slow things down. You've got the channels. They're filled with water. And this seems fine. But they realized that you could make your reactor more efficient if you put some graphite at the end of your control rods. And they're all about efficiency. But this sounds fine. Efficiency is not a bad thing. But what this means, if you do an emergency shutdown, a scram, so you want to insert all the control rods at the same time, they'll start pushing the graphite downwards. And so at the bottom of the reactor, that graphite is moving the water away, so the water is being replaced with graphite. And graphite is a much better moderator than water. This will speed up the reaction, especially as the Chernobyl scram process takes about 18 seconds. So this is a very dangerous situation, because it means that your emergency shutdown procedure actually increases the reaction rate for a few seconds. And a few seconds is quite long enough. If you've got some rods in, then the effect is less pronounced, because you're only displacing water in some of the channels, but this is very dangerous. And every system has issues and trade-offs. The message here isn't just, hey, this was a bad design. I mean, you could still do a good talk about that, I guess, but it would be of limited relevance to the people here. Stick your hand up if you work on nuclear reactors. Good, no one. So yeah, we all have issues. The web app, it might be something like this, so maybe lack of resilience to a certain failure type. I know the applications I deploy, because we're cheapskates, we should have one NAT gateway per availability zone, but they're expensive, and really one NAT gateway for a region is fine. But we've made that trade-off. Maybe you rely on unmaintained software, you'd like to upgrade at some point, but you're making that trade-off. Or your marginal DB usage at peak times, and you haven't quite got the cash to upgrade to a bigger instance. Or they can be kind of process things. Maybe common tasks are just quite difficult or very manual. And these are domain-specific, they're even app-specific. What's more interesting are kinds of cultural flaws and limitations. Problems with the organization, with the humans, how they interact, because that transfers much more to other domains. So the first one I want to talk about is of targets and deadlines. This is your classic, congratulations, comrade, you made 1,000 tractors this year. Next year, we expect 1,500. So the RBMK design went straight to production. They didn't build any small-scale prototypes first. So some of the issues I mentioned, they knew about, just didn't tell anyone. Some of them they discovered when they operated them. So I mentioned they were running this very low fuel enrichment rate of 1.8%. They had a partial meltdown at Leningrad, which we didn't tell anyone about, but then later increased it to 2%. They also had a lot of construction shortcuts and defects. They had problems with concrete quality. They had problems with weld quality. The roof was supposed to be covered in a sort of flame retardant sealant, but they ran out of that. So they used bitumen instead to not delay the project. And bitumen is flammable. And this will become relevant later. And this is not an environment where you push back on deadlines. You don't say, hey, this isn't workable. Can we take longer? You just accept the deadline. You know in your own head it's not going to happen. But yeah, so you don't have that open communication. They also have a hippo problem. I mean, not the large and dangerous semi-aquatic mammal. The other meaning of hippo is the highest paid person's opinion. This is not a culture where you question a superior, whatever superior means in your organization. The senior person is right, kind of by default. The deputy chief engineer, as we'll see, forced several key decisions. They're big fans of secrecy. So nuclear incidents are state secrets, basically. And not just from the general public. Obviously, you don't want them worrying, but including from plant operators. So although Chernobyl and Leningrad are the same design, and they know there was some sort of issue at Leningrad, they don't know what it was. They don't know why. The positive scram, that's not a theoretical possibility. That's something that has been observed at other plants. But Chernobyl operators, they don't know about it. Even within a plant. So in 1982, there was a partial meltdown of Unit 1 in the evening. So the people leaving the day shift, they kind of noticed that stuff was up as something was happening as they left. But they came in the next day, like, hey, what happened last night? It looked like things were happening. And you're stonewall, no, nothing happened yesterday. Everything is normal. And which is just wild. And yeah, the KGB are often on site. You don't want any fear-mongering. You could say, they're more worried about escape of information than escape of radiation. And obviously, people cover stuff up in the West as well. There's a plant in the UK called Windscale that had an incident. The details didn't come out for a long time. But this is kind of on the next level. Nikyet, that's sort of design research bureau thing. So they publish these directives, but obviously they can't actually explain them because they don't want to give away those, that information. So the directives come down, but there's very little context. So they know about the positive scram issue, but what they just say is, hey, just always keep this percentage of rods inserted. Don't ask why, just don't worry about it, just do it. Not, hey, this is a critical safety issue, you really need to pay attention to this one. So the plant operators don't know about this critical flaw in the shutdown system, in their emergency system. It's just one other directive that you add to a long list of directives that you have to bear in mind while trying to meet your unreachable target. So because of this, issues happen to other people. The West things are slightly different, so everyone knows about 3 Mile Island. It was a meltdown in Pennsylvania in 1979. There had also been incidents elsewhere in the USA, in Canada, the plant called Chalk River, in the UK, I mentioned the wind scale. But the lesson that they take from this is, or this shows the dangers of capitalism and the decadent West. At the right levels, they do know about this. So again, Nikiet, they published a report in 1980 that showed that there were several types of accidents that weren't just theoretical edge cases, like maybe if 3 things go wrong at the same time, and really that should never happen. Not just edge cases like that, but in normal operation, certain types of accidents are likely. So they make some design changes behind the scenes, but in general, they're not upgrading existing plants with them, or at least not with any urgency. Chernobyl was due to receive some of these updates after they were about to shut down the plant for maintenance. Obviously, they never got that far. This is a picture from a magazine called Soviet Life, the February 1986 edition. It's this sort of propaganda thing they put out into the Western embassies, showing about how great it is to live in the Soviet Union. So here, a town born of the atom refers to Pripyat, which was the town they built to house the workers. The little text down the bottom says, Soviet-made precision tools are used to machine the parts of a turbine. And it's still very clean and sleek, the white hot of cutting-edge technology. And these are the highly skilled, rigorously examined staff that keep everyone safe. At the same time, the Ukrainian Minister for Power was quoted saying the risk of a meltdown at Chernobyl was roughly 1 in 10,000 years, which was a statement that did not age well. So I think if you add all this up together, though, you can see why it's like failure is not an option. Incidents have never happened. The technology is perfect, and suggesting otherwise is disloyal. And that is a terrible thing. Not only because it's not true. So in 1982, that incident I mentioned, that did result in radiation being released into the environment. There was one in 1984, again, radiation released, and weakening some of the building. That one was only really revealed when they opened some of the KGB files in 2020 or so. It's a terrible thing because failure, especially safe failure, is a very powerful learning mechanism. At Skillerwell, where I work, we say people learn from people learn from feedback, and people learn from failure. So if you pretend failure doesn't exist, you're just suppressing a key learning mechanism. Lessons from all those incidents and near misses they had, gone. That positive scram, it happened in a case where it didn't matter so much that reactor activity went up when they tried to shut it down. But maybe if that lesson had been passed on, maybe it wouldn't have happened. So what's the alternative to this? I think openness is what we should be aiming for. So as I said, all systems have flaws, trade-offs, and so on. There's nothing to be ashamed about the fact that your system also has flaws, limitations, and so on. We can be open about that. We can talk about it, or at least internally. And we all make mistakes. Own your mistakes. Especially if you're in a position of leadership or seniority. You don't want your more junior members of the team thinking that, they're stupid and make mistakes, but one day they'll be smart and never make mistakes again. Or because the lead engineer on the team says that this is the way to do it, they can't possibly be wrong. And don't just talk about them, write them down, disseminate them, make this information easy to access. When an incident does happen, when, not if, resolve that in the open. It doesn't need to be like a private DM between the two people who happen to be around that day. Seeing an incident being troubleshooted and diagnosed live, that's a very powerful learning mechanism. And listen to all the opinions in the room. It's easy to overlook things. You get used to doing things one way, and then someone else comes along and they have a different perspective. Now, it's quite hard to embrace kind of openness when there are KGB staff everywhere, but hopefully you don't have to deal with that. But in all seriousness, it is obviously a lot harder than the CEO putting out a mission statement saying, we're very open here, and then not telling you about the redundancies that are coming or something. It is something that needs to come from the top, I think. It needs something that the senior leadership have to model. You have to create that psychological safety where people feel able to be open. Part of that, I think, is making failure safe. What can that look like? I mean, again, there will be variations, but I think it's things like having test suites so that you don't find out about bugs when you deploy, sandbox environments, having the right kind of processes around reviews and deployments. Those manual error-prone tasks, automate them so that someone doesn't have to go through a 12-step process, which each one can be crucial. And where possible, design away those sharp corners. Remove the danger button. And again, we try and do that at Skidwell. In the sessions that we run, we try and make you experience mistakes without the consequences. We give you access to sandbox AWS accounts for some sessions, for example. Right, so onto the accident. So this starts April 25th, 1986, and they're about to run a test, which should have been run in 1983. And they're under a lot of pressure to complete the test today, or it's going to be pushed back another year. They're about to go into a planned maintenance period. It was supposed to happen during the day, but it doesn't because there's a different plant which is offline for an unrelated reason. And so the grid says, no, you can't power down Unit 4 Chernobyl. We need the power during the peak production period. They've got production quotas. So before they even started, people getting jumpy. There's like specialist crews from out of town, like, hey, is this thing happening or not, or can we just go home? And what they're testing is a safety mechanism. And because they're only testing a safety mechanism, actually a lot of senior, the chief engineer of the plant, is not really aware of it because this is just a test of an electrical system, in theory. Power stations need power, and that sounds silly, but it's one of the reasons why grid failures, like they had in Texas a few years ago, or Spain more recently, can be slow to fix. There's a lot of equipment that needs power. The big one you might worry about in a nuclear power plant are the coolant pumps. And if the grid were to fail completely, they do have diesel generators on site, obviously, but those take 1 to 2 minutes to come fully online. And they judge that that's an unacceptable time to not have the coolant pumps running. However, you do, if the power goes offline, you still have a huge amount of energy, in those turbines that's spinning, the steam pressure in that system. So you can use that to drive a rundown unit that will just keep the pumps going for just a minute. At least that's the theory. They've tried to test this multiple times before, and it hasn't worked. And they really want to prove that they do actually have this safety capability. There are some bad decisions that happen. So the deputy chief engineer, he makes a snap call, like past 11, 12 p.m. at night, to run the test at a much lower power level. There are other staff that say, hey, this is dangerous, they know the reactor design is harder to control at low power levels, but he insists, he's the boss, they eventually comply. There's an operator makes a mistake operating a computer system and accidentally pushes the system down into an even lower power level, roughly 5% of what it should be at. Pretty much shut down the reactor. And really at that point, they should have said, okay, it's not happening today. But again, the deputy chief engineer insists that they continue. And to get the reactor going again, they basically have to withdraw all of the control rods. So they create this very dangerous situation. And again, they know they shouldn't, but they don't know how bad it is to do it. And the chief engineer, deputy chief engineer, is very insistent, and it's pretty much a case of, if you don't do it, get out, and I'll find someone else who will. So they do. And they run the test, which does actually basically work. But but they've created a system on the edge. In this dangerous situation, the pumps are kind of slowing towards the end of the test. Steam is building up, so that positive void feedback loop's starting to kick in. But they do conclude the test, and it's time, the day's over in theory. They press one of these buttons, the top middle one, I think, which is the AZ5 button, which people aren't entirely sure why they did this rather than let it sort of shut down slowly. They didn't really need to press the emergency shutdown button, but they do it anyway. There's little wax seals and plastic covers because you don't want to press that by accident. But within seconds, the positive scram and positive void feedback combine. Reactivity goes through the roof. The fuel channels rupture. There are 2 explosions in quick succession. One that kind of blows off the roof and the cover, and the second one that throws even more of the contents of the core outside. So there's tons of graphite, fuel channels, et cetera, pulverized and sent up into the sky. That graphite core, the second it's exposed to the atmosphere, it catches fire, both the bits that are still on the inside and the bits that are now littering the surrounding area. This is one of the earliest photos of the aftermath, taken mid-afternoon the next day. And one thing that happens in that intervening period is they're in their control bunker, their senior management, and they just cannot accept the things that are as bad as the reports they're getting from the outside are. Like, it can't be that bad. It can't fail in that way. So, for example, 6 hours after the explosion, they were still directing a lot of their effort towards getting the water pumps going again to cool the core down. Sounds like a good idea. But this is what the core looks like at this point. So that disc in the middle is that 1,000-ton bit of concrete that's been not just shifted, it's been flipped. This stuff here is known as Elena's hair. These are the fuel bundles which they're trying to cool by pumping water somewhere. And what they're actually doing is pumping radioactive water just all over the shop. And this thing is balanced at quite a precarious angle. It's just kind of sitting on rubble. It could fall over kind of at any point and just send huge clouds of radioactive dust everywhere. This is another view. The building to the right is the turbine halls. You can see some of the damage that's sort of lower right. The picture of the roof is kind of caved in. This is Unit 3 of Chernobyl. And the Unit 3 and the roof are covered with burning graphite from the explosion. And if you remember, that roof is covered in something that's also flammable. So that's a huge problem they have initially. They don't want, they've got one problem on their hands. They don't also want Unit 3 to be compromised. They did get Unit 3 back on. Unit 3 generated power from December 1987 until December 2000. They basically just filled all the corridors between Units 3 and 4 with concrete. It kept on going for another 13 years. It's like a legacy service that you just can't wait to decommission, but you can't. They no longer had a separate team for Unit 3 because no one wanted to work in there, and people would rotate in and out. So what can go wrong, or what can go wronger? What are they worried about? Escape of radiation, so they're both in both directions, so up. There's a fire burning that's generating huge clouds of fine particles that are spreading over Eastern and Western Europe. They're worried about stuff collapsing and again making great big clouds of radioactive particles. They're worried about escape of radiation in the downwards direction, so the water table is relatively shallow. That water table feeds a river. That river keeps most of Ukraine in drinking water, so they're worried about that. They're worried about steam explosions. So there are water tanks under the reactor building. If some hot chunk of melted uranium metal mess hits that, it could just explode all over again. And don't forget, there are 3 other nuclear reactors on site. This could be one of 4. And further criticality. So maybe if the right amount of uranium gets in the right place, maybe the nuclear reaction will start up again. And again, 3 other nuclear reactors on site. So they're trying a lot of things in parallel. They're pumping out water from these tanks. They've got helicopters lobbing material around. At one point, there was a plan to drill holes in the ground so they can freeze it with liquid nitrogen, and so on. But I want to turn your attention to how they communicated about this. How does one declare an incident? And And I think the short version is try not to. So this explosion happens early hours of April 26th. The next day, so at about 12 hours at lunchtime, they start a temporary evacuation of Pripyat. I mean, spoiler alert, those people never go home again. But at the time, they're told, pack enough clothes for 3 days. But they're still not saying this. It's like, this is just a precaution. Don't worry about it. The next day, there's a nuclear plant in Sweden, Forsmark, and they get some abnormal radiation readings. And when they look into it, they realize it's not coming from inside the plant, it's coming from outside. And they've got access to weather data, they know which way the wind is blowing, it's coming from Chernobyl. But Moscow denies anything. They first acknowledged an incident that evening. They put out a 23-word statement. A mishap happened, it's all fine, don't worry. The next day, it does at least make the evening news, which just says there was an explosion and 2 people are dead. At this point, radiation has not been mentioned once. Even though they are doing things, the evacuation zone gets expanded multiple times and so on. It's mentioned for the first time the next day. They say the situation is improving. I mean, that fire that I mentioned, which is generating those huge plumes of radioactive smoke, wasn't put out for another 10 days. I guess maybe it was improving. I mean, the short-lived byproducts are decaying, but that's not them doing anything, that's just physics. So yeah, they didn't do a lot of communicating. But this is a helicopter. They used a lot of helicopters. Some of them were just trying to see what was happening. They also tried dropping best part of over 5,000 tons of sand, lead, clay, boron on the core. Some of these are neutron absorbers, so to stop it going critical again. Some of them are just to contain stuff. But because of the radiation, they couldn't get very close, and they couldn't hang around either. So they were just kind of like lobbing it at the core from a distance. And when they later did investigate some deeper inside the building, they found that basically none of it had got anywhere near the core. So it's not just that it did nothing. Every single one of those flights stirred up huge amounts of radioactive dust. Every second the helicopter is operating, the downdraft is moving stuff around. Every time you throw 500 kilos of sand into the remains of the reactor, that sends stuff everywhere. So, net negative on these. Which brings me to my next top tip, which is don't make things worse by guessing. Keep an open mind. Don't jump to a conclusion about why is this system misbehaving? Why is this website down? Even if the last time it was the same, it looks like it was the same thing, maybe it's different this time. Beware of the unintended consequences of your action. I have definitely been in a case where I have blamed the quote-unquote obvious culprit, restarted a service to fix it, and now I have 2 problems, not 1 problem. And be prepared. They were limited in how prepared they could be because you have to sign up to this belief that everything is great and nothing ever fails. So they don't have a detailed plan for how to evacuate Pripyat, because why would you? Even talking about that is saying that you don't believe that the technology is perfect, and that's not really where you want to go. But again, hopefully you don't have those problems. So you can think about, how is your system going to fail? Is it infrastructure problems? Is it DDoS attacks? What if some third-party API that you're dependent on goes down or starts behaving badly? Make those plans. This is a few weeks after, so you've got reactor 1 in the foreground and 2 and 3 in the background. Sorry, 3 and 2 in the background. This is the start of what they call the cascade wall. So they got the big cranes, which you can see. They lifted in metal containers, and they filled those with concrete. And once you built a row of those, you can get a little bit closer, build the next row. They tried using kind of military robots, both for this and for clearing the burning stuff off the roof. But the robots couldn't deal with the radiation and would just go haywire very quickly. They did sometimes refer to as the humans who are doing this work as the bio-robots. Slightly chilling. But anyway, November 1986 or so, they get to this. Reactor 4 safely wrapped up in the sarcophagus, and with the rest of the plant carrying merrily on. At this point, reactor 3 is still shut down, but reactors 1 and 2 are back up again. So it took over 100,000 people to build this structure. and many more hundreds of thousands of people to continue to clean up of the surrounding area in the subsequent years. Very few people of those hundreds of thousands carried dosimeters, and of those who did, they're often only sensitive to one type of radiation. And even the ones who did carry all that equipment often ignored it to get, an extra pay packet. So it's not known that widely exactly how many people died because of that, but probably quite a lot. The blame game. So yeah, obviously they're making the site safe, but they're also trying to work out what happened. So there's an investigation which produces a report, and then there's a trial in 1987. And you can probably guess that the answer is not, hey, our design was bad. No, it's a kind of a classic Soviet show trial. It's all the fault of the plant operators. They ignore regulations. And conveniently, quite a lot of them are dead and can't defend themselves. And they kind of grudgingly acknowledge that, yeah, we could make some things better. But really, there wasn't any detailed discussion of design failures until the 1990s. In 1992, they updated the original incident report and said, hey, yeah, actually, there was a hell of a lot of stuff that was wrong here. And I'd speculate that if it hadn't been for the collapse of the USSR in the intervening years, we would have been waiting a lot longer for that. In 2008, they did eventually give posthumous awards to a lot of these people that had been blamed to begin with. So yeah, this is my take. Blame systems and processes, not people. So maybe a junior on-call engineer makes a mistake. The question is, why were they in that position? Why didn't they have the right safety net or the relevant knowledge? If the design makes it likely that a mistake will occur, fix that design. Don't just add another bullet point to a wiki page saying how dangerous this thing is, and while still leaving the big red danger button there. I used to work on a system where it was very easy to deploy to production when you meant to deploy to staging, and we had a few incidents because of that. But I was young and stupid and didn't know this, so we just called this doing a Gary in honor of the first person to make that mistake. I still sometimes call it doing a Gary, but I don't work with them anymore, so it's okay. And this sarcophagus, right from the start, this was a temporary solution, just built basically as fast as they could. So some of the roof support beams are just there sitting on walls that they know have been damaged by the explosion. And there are increasing problems that are building up. There's water that leaks through the roof, trickles through all the mess inside, and then seeps into the ground, heavily contaminated. So like all temporary solutions, it was a good 20 years before they started fixing it. It's a tough problem, and a lot of arguments about who's going to pay for it. So this photo is from 2013. It shows the start of the new safe confinement. And there is still quite a lot of radiation that close to the core, so they kind of built it off to one side, which you can see better from this angle, so off in the distance, and they're building it up. And yeah, a tough job. The radiation means that people work very short shifts. The ground is a mess, and they don't want to dig into the ground because that's just going to release more contamination, and they really don't want to do that. It's also complicated because this doesn't just have to contain all the bad stuff. They're going to hang cranes from the inside of it so they can demolish and deconstruct the sarcophagus once it's in place. But eventually they get it done in 2017, and basically this whole building which they built to one side, they just slid it along the ground on a series of rails. So I guess my final lesson is use rails. That's good. And yeah, that is everything I had. I highly recommend this book, Midnight in Chernobyl. It's kind of my primary source for all the reactor stuff. And yeah, I'd love to talk to you about your disasters, or Skidderwell, or anything else really. Yeah, thanks for having me.